Donald Trump said America was about to finish the job. He stood in front of the country and talked the way presidents talk when they need people to believe the hardest part is already behind them. We are winning. Our objectives are nearly complete. The next 2 or 3 weeks will be decisive. We are going to hit Iran extremely hard. That is the moment I want to start with, not with a map, not with a history lesson, with that moment. Because when a president starts talking like victory is close, while people inside Washington are openly gaming out a ground invasion of Iran, the real story is usually not that the war is going well. The real story is that the air war may not be producing the outcome he needs. And if that is true, then the next question is the only one that matters. What happens if America actually goes in on the ground? Most people answer too fast. They imagine another Iraq, another march inward, another television sequence where the opening move is confused for the whole war. I think that is exactly the wrong way to think about it, because the real story is not whether America can enter Iran. Of course it can enter Iran. The real story is what kind of chain reaction begins the moment it does. Iran is not Iraq. That is not rhetoric. It is geography. Iran is huge. The terrain is hostile to any outside army. Come in from Iraq and you hit the Zagros Mountains, a natural fortress built for concealment, ambush, drones, and attrition. Come from the east and you run into desert distance and thin logistics. Come from the south and you still have to push inland through heat, mountains, and long exposed supply lines before you get anywhere near Tehran. That matters, because wars are not decided by entry, they are decided by sustainment. America is very good at the first punch. It is much less good at the long period after the first punch. When every road needs fuel, escorts, repair crews, helicopters, medevac routes, and political patience. That is where this becomes dangerous. Iran has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. Not a symbolic strike, a real attempt to break the state by force. That means underground facilities, distributed missile stocks, drone networks, hardened positions, and a defense concept built around one assumption. America wins quickly in the sky and then starts bleeding slowly on the ground. So the first phase of an invasion is easy to imagine. The invasion begins, American forces cross into Iranian territory. For a short period, television coverage looks manageable. Air cover is overwhelming. Some positions fall, commentators talk about momentum. The regime looks weaker than advertised, then the structure changes. Convoys start taking hits, helicopters become targets, narrow roads become traps, fuel becomes a war of its own. The line between front and rear disappears, because the rear is where the supply chain lives, and the supply chain is exactly what Iran would attack. The mountains stop being scenery and become a weapon. That is the first tree of consequences, the military tree, and it already ends badly. Either America commits far more manpower than it realistically wants to commit, or it tries to run a war of intimidation with insufficient ground mass, which is the worst of both worlds. Too visible to stay politically cheap, too thin to impose order, but the military problem is only the first layer. The second layer is the one most people still underestimate. The moment a ground invasion begins, Iran no longer has much reason to hold back its full economic retaliation. Up to now, the war has lived in that familiar gray zone where everyone signals, everyone threatens, everyone calibrates. A ground invasion destroys calibration. Once foreign troops are crossing your territory, you stop thinking in terms of pressure and start thinking in terms of systemic pain. And Iran's most obvious instrument of systemic pain is still the Strait of Hormuz. People hear that and think only about oil that is already serious enough. But the deeper problem is that Hormuz is not just an oil valve, it is part of a much larger industrial bloodstream. Energy moves through it. Insurance confidence moves through it. Shipping schedules move through it. Fertilizer inputs move through it. Parts of the chemical and manufacturing chain move through it. If Hormuz becomes a battlefield rather than a threatened corridor, the shock does not stop at gasoline. It moves into food. It moves into industrial pricing. It moves into supply chains that were already running on thinner margins than people admit. That is why the second tree of consequences is not just an energy tree, it is a cascading supply tree. If Iran concludes that invasion means regime survival is now linked to maximum global disruption, then the logic becomes simple. Make the price of occupying Iran larger than the value of occupying Iran. Make every ship a risk. Make every refinery nervous. Make every importer calculate scarcity. Make every market ask the same question at once. How much of the old system still works if this corridor really breaks? And that takes us to the deepest layer, the financial and geopolitical layer, for decades. The old American-led order rested on a basic promise: the sea lanes would function, the Gulf would remain governable, oil would keep flowing through a system priced, financed, and secured inside an American umbrella. That system was never just about fuel. It was about trust. Trust that the corridor would stay open, trust that the energy heart of the world economy would remain manageable, trust that the United States could absorb shocks and still keep the machinery of the wider order intact. A ground invasion of Iran puts that trust on trial, because if America invades and the region blows outward instead of folding inward, then the message to Europe and Asia is no longer that America secures order. The message is that America itself can become the force that detonates the order its allies depend on. That is when the question changes. It stops being, can Washington punish Tehran? It becomes, can the existing American-centered system survive the method Washington is using to punish Tehran? This is where I think most people miss what may be sitting underneath Trump's behavior. The common interpretation is chaos, impulse, vanity, overreach. I understand why, but there is a darker interpretation, and it is more coherent than many people want to admit. What if the people around Trump do not believe the old global structure is worth preserving in its current form? What if they think the debt-heavy, finance-heavy, globally overextended model is already decaying? What if they think the age of subsidizing the security architecture of the entire world is ending? Anyway, what if they believe America should stop trying to hold together an open planetary order and instead reposition itself as the core of a harder, more self-sufficient continental bloc? That is the real argument hiding underneath all the noise. Not empire maintenance, empire triage, not preserve the old order at all costs. Break the old order in a controlled way and make sure North America comes out of the wreckage in a stronger material position than everybody else. That is why all the apparently disconnected moves start looking less disconnected. Pressure on Canada, pressure on Greenland, pressure around Panama, moves toward Venezuela. Constant talk about control, perimeter, depth, self-sufficiency. Production, insulation. You can call that madness if you want. But there is a logic to it. The logic is that if the globalized order is going to fracture, then the winning region will not be the region with the prettiest speeches. It will be the region with food, water, hydrocarbons, minerals, industrial capacity, defensible geography, and enough political ruthlessness to admit that the age of universal management is ending. Put differently, the theory is this: let the old imperial model die, let the debt machine crack, let the sea lane consensus fracture, then rebuild from the continent outward. A fortress before an empire, a resource base before a moral vocabulary, a hard shell rather than a universal system that does not make it wise, it does not make it humane, it does not make it likely to succeed cleanly, but it does make the behavior more intelligible. And if you read the Iran question through that lens, the invasion scenario becomes even more dangerous, because then failure in Iran does not necessarily look like failure to the people who are prepared to sacrifice the old order. If they believe North America can ride out the storm better than Europe, better than East Asia, better than the Gulf monarchies, then even an ugly war can be rationalized as a transition cost. That is the third tree of consequences, the order tree. And it is the most unsettling of all America invades. The war becomes harder than advertised. Hormuz turns from pressure point into rupture point. Shipping confidence collapses. Energy pricing becomes violent. Global trust in the old architecture weakens, and the parts of the world with internal depth resources and protected geography suddenly matter more than the parts built on assumption, finance, and uninterrupted flow. Notice what is hiding inside that logic. Ordinary people pay first, not the strategists, not the speechwriters, not the men drawing continental maps. Ordinary people, Americans who get sent into a war whose logistical mathematics already look ugly. Iranians who absorb bombing, invasion, sanctions, and internal ruin. Families in poorer states who discover very quickly that shipping shocks become price shocks and price shocks become food shocks. That is always the hidden bill. The powerful talk about structure, the public pays in flesh and price. So let me bring this back to the question I started with. What happens if America actually invades Iran on the ground? The shallow answer is a very difficult war. The deeper answer is the war does not stay a war. It becomes a trigger. A trigger for military overextension, a trigger for Hormuz escalation, a trigger for supply chain fear, a trigger for financial distrust, a trigger for a larger decision about whether the old American old order is still being defended or is being consciously burned down and replaced with something harder, smaller, and more brutal. That is why I think the invasion question is the most important question in the world right now, because if it happens, this is not just another Middle East campaign. It is a referendum on what kind of world comes after the one we have been living in. And if you want the cleanest version of the whole argument, it is this. America can invade Iran. What it cannot control is everything that begins the moment it does. That is the real danger, not the entry, the chain reaction.